So strong women in the lineage of Moshiach, part 2. Just a couple of corrections I want to make. One was that we had this whole thing last time about figuring out 10 generations from Judah to David. It's easy. Judah, 1. David, 10. That's it. Also, Bethuel, still a man. Sarah, I think some people got a little confused. Sarah is not in line between Tamar and Shem. According to some sources, Shem was her father, which generationally causes issues, but we'll go with that. However, if you really want to have some fun with it, let's point out that Sarah, who was married to Abraham, here are we going to do this? We're going to bring this all the way around and put Sarah here. But Sarah, it's hard to find a way to line this up, but Sarah was actually Lot's brother. So I don't know how you want to draw a line there, but Sarah and Lot were brothers, which means that Lot was simultaneously Abraham's nephew, grandnephew, and brother-in-law. Abraham was not, however, his own grandfather. So also, Yitro and his link, he's not related to Bethuel, it goes right through. Yitro and his link to Midian, and therefore Abraham, that is not I'm not going to say it's not a traditional link. Generally, Balak and Yisro are regarded as having been contemporaries. They were, according to the Midrash, both advisors to Paro in Egypt. The link listing Yisro as an ancestor of Balak is from the Zohar. So take that with however many grains of salt you like, but at least according to one source in the Zohar, you can trace Balak back to Abraham, and therefore Ruth on one side back to Abraham. So there's a lot that's going on here. Most of these links are pretty straightforward and pretty clear. Some of them, like I said, the Yisro link, some of those are a little more obscure. Also, just to pick up, I said that some of the best stuff that happened last week actually happened in the discussion after the video was turned off. And I think it actually makes for a suitable reintroduction, which is the whole idea here with Moshiach and the lineage of Moshiach, and we're going to see the women involved, is that what is the idea of Moshiach? The whole idea of Moshiach is the idea that in the Messianic age, the innate, essential spirituality of the universe becomes apparent. The famous line is, Bayom ha'hu yihyeh Hashem echad u'shmo echad. Hashem is one and His name is one. That is, Hashem as He is in His essence and Hashem as He is in His name in this world become united in the sense that the entire world understands clearly how the world is godly. And this is put in there's many different phrases that are used to explain this, whether it's elevating sparks of holiness, or whether it's uncovering the godliness or elevating things in the world. The famous example of, you eat food, you make a bracha, you use the food for mitzvahs, now that food has been elevated and all the ingredients in it have been elevated. Whatever terminology you want to use, the concept of Mashiach is about uncovering the spirituality in the mundane. And what these women here are doing is essential to that process. That these women are, throughout here, in their various unusual methods of coming about bringing offspring into the world, they are taking something that is essentially a gray zone. It is something that can be both very physical and very spiritual, and that is human sexuality. And they are showing how it is essentially a holy, positive thing. And that is what Lot and his daughters are doing in their unusual procreative act. That's what Tamar is doing in going around the back door and, setting herself up to basically entrap Judah into procreating with her. Ruth through marrying Boaz in what is basically a levirate marriage. Bathsheba, who comes to have a child with David in unusual circumstances. In all of these circumstances, we're going to have the trope over and over of women employing their sexuality and what is essentially a black and white zone, a gray zone, where the first thing that Adam and Chava noticed when they ate the fruit of the tree of knowledge, right? The first thing that they realized, the Torah tells us, is that they realized that they were naked. Once they ate the tree of knowledge of good and evil, so that the knowledge of good and evil becomes now mixed. Before they ate good and evil, good was clear, evil was clear, you could keep them apart. Once they eat the tree, now there's confusion in the world. And the first thing they notice is that they're naked. They notice their sexuality. They notice that their sexuality is not pure, that there is some kind of confusion that it can be either a good thing or a negative thing. And, at the risk of sounding sexist or something like that, I will say that there is a certain extent to which the power of sexuality is a power that women hold over men. I mean, there's a certain aspect in which, and we'll see in each of these stories, that there is a certain way that women can use their power of sexuality to influence men. And that's what's going to happen in each of these cases. And Ruth, it's less clear because Boaz seems to be in a very positive situation. Ruth seems to be, there doesn't seem to be the same kind of weird deception going on as there is in the other cases, but we're going to see even in the case of Ruth how it wasn't an overt thing, but there was that aspect there. So to go back, we talked last week about Tamar and the daughters of Lot. And unfortunately, we don't have names for the daughters of Lot. And we talked about their outstanding qualities. And in the case of the daughters of Lot, their qualities were hospitality, and that they were incredibly giving people. Interestingly, the idea of basically incestuous relationships is referred to in the Torah occasionally as chesed, kindness. The sages tell us that ha'olam b'chesed yibana, the world is built on chesed. One meaning of that line, that the world is built on chesed, is that the first couples in humanity, the children of Adam and Chava, who did Cain marry? Who did Abel marry? Their sisters. The world is built on kindness, that God did a kindness in allowing those unions in order for the world to continue to exist. Now, unbounded kindness is the breaking down of barriers and creating of loving relationships. When that is unbounded, when that is uncontrolled, that becomes negative, and that becomes a negative use of human relationships. However, in the case of Lot and his daughters, they were in the situation of the first humans. They thought that they were the sole remaining human beings on earth. And it was this concept of kindness which they displayed in caring for people in Sodom, caring for needy people, that again, this aspect of chesed somehow rises its head again in the daughters of Lot. And I think it's very interesting that chesed is the term that is used euphemistically for this kind of relationship in order to maintain the chain of human existence. Tamar is famously, she's known as the Tsunua. She's known as being very, she is very modest in her ways, that she is not going to throw it all out there. And our sages say this is why Yehuda, when he went in to cohabit with her, didn't recognize her, right? You would think at a certain point, you pay you pay the harlot on the side of the road, or as we saw last week, really she was standing outside of Abraham's tent and all that that implies. But, so you pay this woman, you go in to be with her, and at a certain point he would recognize her. And our sages tell us that the reason he didn't recognize her was that she had been so tsenua in the home of her father-in-law that he did not recognize her. Now, what's interesting though is that, and again we see this with the way in which she calls out Yehuda as the father of her child when the moment comes and they're going to execute her for adultery, and she says, she doesn't say, it was Judah. She doesn't throw her sexuality out there for everybody to see. She says, whoever these belong to, that's the father, and she lets it slowly be uncovered, the nature of her union. However, her very act, the thing that she had to do to continue the line of Moshiach, was the exact opposite. It was to pose as a harlot. It was to pose as the exact opposite sort of woman who goes out there and puts her sexuality out there on the line for anyone. And so she went against her very own personality trait and used that, again, the flip side of her own personality trait, and used that in a way to engage Yehuda and bring about the continuation of the line of Moshiach. So it's all about this sort of flipping what can be either a positive or a negative thing, and these women in the line of Moshiach who take a hold of that and really demonstrate that they are elevating what can be a very base desire into a very holy and useful tool, and really that everything in this world should be. Anything that is permitted because it can be used as a tool in the service of Hashem. And unfortunately, with the men around them, sometimes they had to employ this tool in a way that maybe they wouldn't have if the men around them were a little bit more clear-sighted. But as it may be, these women took control. So I want to move down to Ruth. And Ruth, we have a lot of material on Ruth. She's got her own book in the Bible, right? So we have a lot of biblical content on Ruth. We have a lot of commentary on Ruth. So I want to talk specifically, though, about her relationship with her husband and with Boaz. So initially we have her relationship with her husband Machlon. Now the basic story, right? Elimelech and Naomi, her in-laws, they go with their children Kilion and Machlon. They leave Israel and they go to Moab due to a famine. They're wealthy. They basically don't want to be sapped by local need, so they take their money and go to Moab. Machlon and Kilion die there. Machlon is Ruth's husband. First of all, Machlon marries Ruth in Moab. Let's start there. Naomi and Elimelech go there. Their children take wives there. Machlon marries Ruth. Machlon dies there, ostensibly for the sin of having abandoned his people and then intermarried. Now our sages tell us that in fact Ruth converted when she married Machlon. She did not actually convert later on with Naomi. She converted when she married Machlon. The only thing is, at that time she had converted, the sages say, out of fear of her husband. So whatever that means, she had converted under his influence. And after Machlon and Kilion die, Kilion's wife says, that's it. I presumably she also converted, but then she says, I converted out of duress, I'm gone. She kisses Naomi and she leaves. Ruth says she's going to stay with Naomi. So Ruth now comes back to Israel, and she goes to the field of Boaz, and she's going to glean her wheat. And we see this aspect, and it's brought in the very verses, that she is very protective of her sexuality. It says that she would glean, she would not bend over to gather the grain, she would squat, she would sit to gather the grain so as not to expose herself. So, and it says that she was very attractive physically. So she had a power, she guarded a power, and she used it when necessary. Because what we'll find out is that eventually Naomi says, Ruth, we're here, and you have this relative, Boaz, who is actually, Boaz is actually her uncle-in-law. It's her husband Machlon's, her husband Machlon, his father is Elimelech, Elimelech's brother is Boaz, it's her uncle-in-law. And that line there does not mean she's a descendant of Elimelech, it goes right through. So Ruth now finds out, Naomi says, your closest of kin is Boaz. Now your husband died without child, which means that under Jewish law, your husband's closest of kin is actually supposed to marry you to provide offspring and continue your husband's name. And spiritually, whatever that means is that the husband dies, and that union should produce children, so the husband's closest relative marries the wife if the couple has no children, and spiritually provides offspring for that coupling that was cut off short. So it's interesting what Ruth does and what Naomi tells her to do. I want to focus on the story here. Boaz is in Jerusalem. He's there at the threshing floor where he's going to be, it's the harvest season, it's Shavuos. He is bringing all of his grain and he's going to thresh it here at the public threshing floor. And everybody is there, they're celebrating the harvest. So Naomi says he's going to be there. What you're going to do, you, Ruth, go there. In the dark of night, I want you to sneak in and basically surprise him in the middle of the night. He's going to be sleeping there, guarding his grain. And what she does, she uncovers his sandal. So he's sleeping with his cloak on. She lifts up his cloak and uncovers his sandal. And this wakes him. And there's all kinds of commentary about what then went on. All that we have in the verse is they have this very brief conversation where she basically says, you should marry me, you're my next of kin. He says, you're right, but nobody can know that you are here. Don't go anywhere. Stay here, sleep at my feet. I'll give you some grain. You go away before the sun rises. We'll take care of it in the morning. Now the commentaries give some very interesting shading to this. They say, first of all, that Boaz at this time was about 80. He was a very old man. Ruth herself was no spring chicken. But she was much younger than Boaz. I mean, clearly he was a generation above her. Boaz, the day that Ruth and Naomi returned to Israel, Boaz's wife had died. And further, the verse tells us that from the 6th day of creation, Ruth and Boaz were decreed to be together. Why the 6th day of creation? The Zohar tells us that 40 days before a child is born, it's decreed who that child is going to be matched up with. So why in the case of Boaz and Ruth, why from the 6th day of creation? What was created on the 6th day? It was animals and man and woman. The first match,
Basic.
right, so the first match is made on the 6th day. And at that time, there is a decree that Ruth and Boaz are going to be together. So, in the very fabric of the idea of man and woman, there's the idea that Ruth and Boaz have to be together. So Ruth comes into Boaz and she uncovers his sandal. And there are different interpretations as to why exactly she uncovers his sandal. One reason is that the sandal is used in the chalitza ceremony. So if a closest of kin is not going to marry the widow, then he performs a certain ceremony called chalitza, where he wears a certain type of sandal. She unties the sandal, spits in front of him, and basically, it's an interesting thing, and there's the meaning behind that is a whole thing. But basically, he's saying that I'm discharging my obligation to marry you, and she is then an unmarried woman. Until that point, she's actually considered in a certain way engaged to the husband. So that even today, we don't do the marriage between a surviving closest of kin, but if, God forbid, a married couple, the husband dies and he has no children, and he has a brother, that brother actually has to perform chalitza. The woman and the brother, the widow and the brother have to perform chalitza before she can remarry. She is considered engaged to him in a way until they perform that ceremony. And today we automatically perform that ceremony. The idea of going through with the marriage is moot. We don't do that today. But in the case of Boaz, that's what she was saying. She was uncovering his sandal as a way of sort of hinting at that you are my closest of kin. Boaz, it says now, Boaz lays down, and the Midrash tells us that Boaz spent the entire night praying to Hashem that nothing ill should befall him with this woman. That basically, he says to Hashem, you know I have no intentions with this woman. He says, please keep it that way. Let me make it through the night with both of us clean, because...
Platonic for the night.
Platonic for the night, exactly. So both Ruth and Boaz were very aware of their sexual power and were very aware of maintaining the sacredness of that power. However, it's Ruth going and uncovering Boaz's foot, which also has implications in terms of marriage and in terms of the marital relationship. The idea of uncovering the cloak is also, we see in the Torah when it refers to in Chumash the various forbidden relationships, forbidden marital relationships. It says, do not uncover the cloak of, got to get the wording exactly, but basically it uses a euphemism, uncovering the cloak, as a euphemism for the marital relationship. So there's some aspect here where Ruth is hinting with the uncovering of the foot that this needs to happen between them. And so Ruth, who has always been so guarded about the own energy that she gives off, is now stepping forward and doing something which really, if you think about it, is rather forward.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, sneaking up to a man in his sleep and uncovering his, lifting up his cloak and uncovering his feet. There's a certain energy to that. And she goes and she does that. Boaz actually, when he talks to her then and tells her, don't go anywhere, stay here, leave before it gets, all that, the conversation he has with her, he uses the male conjugation. So that anybody overhearing him won't realize that he's talking to a woman.
Oh, very nice. So he was very tznius also.
He was also very tznius. But, again, it is Ruth. Now, Boaz maybe was her next of kin and should have made the first move. Boaz claims that there is this individual, Ploni Almoni, which the rabbis understand is simply meaning John Doe. Ploni Almoni is not a name, it's a non-name. He says, well, there's this Ploni Almoni who is actually your closer kin, and we have to check with him first. He says, no, I'm not going to do it, so then Boaz steps up. But the case is here where Ruth is going ahead and taking the initiative. And in fact, we see that in last week's Parsha, we see an unusual thing with Rivka. Normally we don't think of biblical women as taking the initiative in their marriages. In the case of Rivka in last week's parsha, actually Eliezer says to her, right, Eliezer says to Lavan, I think this is a great match, we should take her. And they say to Rivka, they say, well, do you want to go? Which is just sort of an interesting thing to note, that with Rivka, she actually has to agree to the marriage before she travels to meet Yitzchak and marry him. So
There were options back then too.
yes. So, and Eliezer was pretty clear on that. Eliezer, even before he left, said, well, what if she doesn't want to come with me? And Avram said, if she doesn't want to come, then you're absolved of your oath to bring a wife. So there was, I think, maybe more than is sometimes written down. In the case of Rivka, we clearly see that they asked her. But in the case of Ruth, she's really going out and initiating. And again, that's the case with all of these women. Now, in the case of Bathsheba is an interesting situation, because Bathsheba, we don't want to think of as having been the initiator. If anything, you could paint Bathsheba as a victim, right? David sees Bathsheba bathing on a rooftop. He desires her. He sends her servants to go get her. He then sends her husband, who is a general in his army, off to battle, where he dies in the front lines, quite intentionally, and then he marries her. Bathsheba seems to be relatively powerless in this situation. And David seems to be acting very questionably. Again, though, we see the commentaries tell us that Bathsheba and David were another one of those sixth-day couples. And it says that in Tehillim, David says he sinned with his tzelah. With his tzelah is rib or side. It's the same word that is used to refer to the part of Adam that was formed into Chava. This tzelah, this side, or as it's sometimes translated, rib. So Bathsheba is David's tzelah. Bathsheba is the Eve to David's Adam. They are meant to be together. And it says what happened was that they should have come together in a proper way. And David, by pushing the matter, actually brought it about in a bad way, in a difficult way. That what the sages tell us, and it goes into great detail actually, in Gemara Sanhedrin, it goes into great detail with the story of David and Bathsheba, and it talks about what went on. But basically what happened was that David saw that in the prayers we refer to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but we don't refer to the God of David. And he said, well, why don't we refer to the God of David? We refer to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And you said that you would make me as great as the forefathers, so why don't we refer to the God of David? And God replies, because the forefathers were tested. You were never tested. He says, fine, so then test me. And God tells him ahead of time, he says, I will test you, and I will test you in matters of desire. So he gives him fair warning. And the problem is that really, had David come across this test without provoking it, he had the strength of character and the appropriate will to overcome that kind of test. The problem is that because he had asked for the test, he was not given the divine assistance to overcome the test. That in the case of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they didn't ask for the test. They had the divine assistance and the power of will that they had built up over the years and over their service and over their dedication to God to withstand the various tests that they were given. When David provokes a test from God, he has now put himself in a bad situation. So back to Bathsheba, she's bathing on the roof. Why is she bathing on the roof? This seems like a rather,
Manipulative.
kind of manipulative, right? Or what's... So the Talmud is very clear. She was not just out bathing on the roof. She had a cone over her, a canopy. Depending on how you translate the word. She was bathing, but she had a bed canopy. She had a cloth hanging over her. And here it becomes interesting. It says that David was constantly involved in Torah study. And as long as he was involved in Torah study, the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, could not affect him. However, it says the Satan took the form of a bird and distracted David for a moment. David sees this bird flying across the sky. He reaches for an arrow to shoot it down. He goes to shoot the bird. The bird moves, and he shoots the canopy, and he splits open the canopy. And there is Bathsheba. Again, there are all kinds of manipulations that are going on here in order to make this happen. Because Bathsheba was obviously not going to be just out bathing on the roof. And David, as much as we do see that he spends a good deal of time afterwards, he is reprimanded by the prophet, and then he spends many psalms asking for forgiveness and repenting for the sin. In fact, his sin was not necessarily the sin of Bathsheba. His sin was the sin of provoking God and provoking a test. The issue with Bathsheba is a result of that, because had he not provoked the test, David was certainly a man of character who could withstand something as basic as going after a woman who wasn't his. As to Bathsheba and her agency, Bathsheba in this situation, it sounds like she didn't have much agency. However, we'll see that Bathsheba, as soon as she's with David, begins to exercise quite a bit of agency. It says that David had many wives. David had many wives, of which Bathsheba was his main wife. Now he had a first wife, Michal, who was Shaul's daughter. Saul, the king before him, had a daughter, Michal, whom he begrudgingly married to David after David became a war hero for defeating Goliath. And he had a son with Michal. And that son would later actually try and claim the throne. He's the firstborn son. Now Bathsheba had first one child with David, and that child died as an infant. And we say that child actually died as a punishment for the sin of that union. And again, to clarify, David, even with the test, even with everything that goes on, it's hard to imagine that David and Bathsheba could have cohabited in a truly adulterous manner. Bathsheba was better than that, David was better than that. So there's a very interesting thing. Bathsheba was married to Uriah, one of David's generals. Before the men would go out to war, they would sign a provisional get, or some say an actual get, to prevent the case of an aguna. That if a husband should die in battle and his body not be recovered, the woman has retroactively been divorced, and therefore is not in the case of an aguna. So at the time that David saw her and called for her, her husband Uriah was at war, and she was actually provisionally or actually divorced. And definitely once Uriah died, she had been retroactively divorced at the time. Furthermore, Bathsheba was not just bathing, she was actually preparing for the mikvah. She was preparing for the mikvah. So she was not only not married technically at the time, she was also not in nida. And finally, Bathsheba let's see. So David, Uriah was at the time technically unmarried to her. They were provisionally divorced. And once he died, they would be retroactively, she was divorced from beforehand. She was not a Nida. The sin was still a sin because, again, it says he pushed the matter. They were supposed to be together. It would have happened. But he pushed the matter through provoking a test. And that was where the sin lay. That David overestimated his own power and put himself in a position. Bathsheba is now the wife of David. She has one child and the child dies as an infant. She has another child, and we see an interesting thing. In the book of Proverbs, there's an interesting line where the commentaries say it's basically Bathsheba scolding Shlomo. It says Shlomo, on the day of the dedication of the Beis Hamikdash, overslept. Whatever that means, there was an issue. Shlomo was overindulging in wine. Bathsheba scolds him. And one of the things she says to him is she reminds him, she says, when I was trying to have a child with David, there were many wives of David who were all trying to have children. And every time they would go to be with David, they would pray, they would say, may I have a child who is fit to be king. May I have a child who is going to be king. But Bathsheba, when she prayed for a child, she said, may I have a child who is a servant of Hashem, who is wise, who is a Torah scholar. And that's how she ends up having Shlomo. Because Bathsheba, in her prayers for children and in her prayers preceding her cohabitation, her intent is not for royalty, but for scholarship, for Torah. And, you know, I don't have the book with me right now to look up the exact quote. I wish I could get it. It's a beautiful quote, what it is. Actually, I do. Let me grab a Sanhedrin here. What my son, and what son of my womb, and what son of my vows. So here Bathsheba is talking about, so what is she saying? Why do you do these sinful things that will brand you as my son and not the son of your father? Everybody knows that your father was a God-fearing man. Now that you sin, they will say it was his mother who caused him to sin. And what of my womb? And here you go. All the other women of your father's household would no longer see the king's face once they conceived. That is, they stopped being intimate as soon as they became pregnant. But I pushed and entered into his chambers to be intimate with him, so that I should have a son who is robust and fair. The rabbis understand that that relations in the third trimester are positive for the child. So how dare you use these very qualities to indulge in the pleasures of this world? And what son of my vows? How can you indulge after the vows I took before you were born? What are those vows? For all the women of your father's household would take the following vow. Let me have a son fit to be a king, and I pledge to do such and such good deed. But I took a different vow. Let me have a son who is robust, filled with Torah knowledge, and fit for prophecy. So, and the word robust, by the way, is an interesting word. They translate it robust here. The word is zariz. Zariz, which is often translated as zealous. As in the phrase, zrizim matim mitzvahs. Those who are zealous are hasty to perform mitzvahs. A zariz is somebody who runs to do the will of Hashem, who runs to do mitzvahs. It's why we do a bris first thing in the morning, because we have this idea of zrizim matim in the mitzvahs. Those who really want to do a mitzvah do it at the first chance possible. So, may I have a son who is hasty to do the will of God, who is wise and who is fit for prophecy, who is filled with Torah knowledge and fit for prophecy. So, Bathsheba, all the other women were content to become pregnant with David and hope that they had a king. Bathsheba prayed not for royalty, but for Torah. And also she engaged David. She continued to engage David after she became pregnant. And she stayed with him, and it says she insisted that he continued to be intimate with her after she became pregnant, because that was understood to somehow be beneficial to the child. So Bathsheba, to whatever extent she did or did not have agency in their initial liaison, once she becomes David's wife, and once she goes about becoming the mother of Shlomo, she takes great agency with the power of her own procreative powers. And then when Shlomo becomes king, she rebukes him about that, saying, I put all this into it, you better straighten up. Don't let anybody say that you get it from me. So Bathsheba does this, and then of course we see it at the beginning of the book of Malachim Beis, the second book of Kings. It opens up, David is old. David is old, and he is ill, and he's sort of retreated from the public eye. His older son, from Michal, his first wife, has declared himself king. Bathsheba goes into David. She finds David in his chamber. She says, hey, David, didn't you say that my son Shlomo was going to be king? Now your older son is proclaiming himself king, and everybody's saying, well, what did David say? What was David's will? She says, I know that you said that Shlomo was going to be king, now you tell them. So Bathsheba goes on to be a very active woman, and not just active in the aspect of producing Shlomo, who would be the line of Moshiach, but in ensuring that Shlomo then takes his place as the head of the Jewish people to continue to be the line of Moshiach. So all these other women, not only was she involved in actually physically producing the line of Moshiach, she was involved in making sure that the line of Moshiach continued properly through Shlomo, and that the line wasn't cut off right there. And then of course Shlomo, just to end off the line, Shlomo marries Naamah, an Ammonite woman, who is again from the daughters of Lot, brings it all the way back in. He has a son Rechavam. Rechavam goes on, and we continue the line of David uninterrupted until the Babylonian exile. So to bring it all together, what I really want to say is that what we see here is women who are taking a very active role in something that can be a very gray area. And this is an area where traditionally we think that men had the main role. In the marital relationship between men and women, in biblical times, we often think of, the man taking a wife. However, to get to the line of Moshiach, we have to have the role of these women who take charge and make sure that the right things happen. So then it becomes a matter of where does this leave us now? First of all, we're living in a very different time, right? I mean, as much as, things stay the same, and yet, the fact that Judah did not recognize Tamar because she was so sneeze in his house, she was probably wearing a veil. Women today don't wear veils. We don't expect women to wear veils. We have laws of tznius. They don't include covering your face. Now again, remember Tamar lived before the Torah was given. But, so the question is, where does this leave us for today? Because we have these strong women of Tanakh who are ensuring the line of Moshiach through taking charge in a certain area and with a certain power that they may have over men, as well as demonstrating, right, as we said, the ability to take something that could be negative or positive and drawing it out of the negative, especially, again, in the case of Lot, Judah, and David, less so in the case of Boaz, but in the case of Lot, Judah, and David, the men involved were not raising up sexuality to its highest pinnacle point. I mean, they were not holding up this act as the most shining, glimmering service of God. It was a relatively base act for these men. Again, you can say that in each of these cases, yes, it had to be, and yes, there was divine involvement with making sure that it happened that way, and at least Judah and David were very good men, and we know that without divine intervention they probably wouldn't have done that. But as it may be, from their point of view, it was not the most shining act. And the women drew it out. So where does that leave us today? If you think about it, you bring it into today, and the man-woman relationship in a Jewish marriage today is very different. We have a situation where, right, marriages are made very much mutually, whether it's, you know, through shidduch dating or through friends or traditional dating, whatever it may be. You know, you have a situation where, you know, you have all these cases where the normal relationship building was obviously very skewed. Today, your average relationship is not going to be that lopsided. So the question, I guess, is, and I'll toss this out at you, so what now do we learn from this then? We see that this was a particularly extreme case of the women having to come to the forefront and take something that could be, you know, go either way and really do something with it. But what does that give us today for our situations, which are not as extreme? We're also, by the way, we're not trying to do something as extreme as produce the line of Moshiach, which we talked about last week. Part of why there's so much, right, part of why there's so much trouble in getting there is because at every step of the way, the forces of negativity in this world are trying to prevent the line of Moshiach from continuing. So part of this also involves the idea of slipping the neshama of Moshiach, so to speak, slipping it under, you know, under the covers. That, you know, the forces of evil, they say, oh, incest, harlotry, desire. Well, those are all fine. I'm going to look the other way. I'm not interested in that. And then the line of Moshiach quietly slips on without too much interference from negative forces. So the fact that the line of Moshiach has to come in this way is, in one sense, in order to prevent it from being curtailed, and in another sense, because it's very much about this, you know, Moshiach is very much about taking the physical and making it spiritual. But what does that give us today? What lesson can we take from that in our lives today?
Well, I think that just from hearing all of these last two classes, what I was taking from it is that the woman seems to really take a really strong role in the home also, in making sure that the home is being led in a proper way to lead it in mitzvot and sniot and to maintain it. I mean, I actually had a recent conversation. There were two people that I was excited about maybe a possible shidduch, and this third party said, you know, we just have to make sure that the girl in this party is the stronger of the two, because it's usually the woman who leads the home in that direction.
So and again, I want to focus on, we hear this thing about women being the home, and women being the idea of bina, and women being internal, and women being the builders versus this whole idea that the chachma is the spark and the bina is the building, and that men are the initiator and women are the builder, and that's true of the physical production of a child as well, that the man, you know, initiates and the woman builds. So there's a lot of this that, you know, the woman is the builder, the woman is internal, and what we see here to some extent is women being initiators. being initiators, and being deeply involved in the role of flipping. And again, I really want to focus on this because that's what Moshiach is about and that's what these women are about, is very involved in this idea of taking what could go either way, or what in some of these cases looked like it was really going the wrong way, and flipping it and showing how it's holy. So I think, we live in a world today where, unfortunately, outside of the Jewish world, in the Jewish world, outside of the Jewish world, I think there's a lot that goes on in relation to women and what it is to be a woman, in terms of, I guess, there is a very confused sense of what femininity is.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean, by femininity, I don't mean to be effeminate. I mean femininity as in what it means to be a woman. And there's a lot that goes into that. What, on many sides. I mean, there's the pink section at Target, there's the, there's the pink section at Target, there's the Bachelorette, there's many forms of feminism that vie for all different versions of what it means to be a woman. There is a more traditional approach that is about this home thing. So there's a lot that goes on, right? And I think that in all of these cases, I would say I'm not in a position to give a definitive answer or anything like that. But I'd say keeping in mind this power to flip. That this is the power that we see with these women. It's the power to initiate the change, to take what looks like it's not going in the right way, and to change that. And that I think that, put aside the Bachelorette and the pink section. I mean, that, we can all talk about, society's, pushing on women in this, in the over-sexualization and the too girly and this and, throw like a girl. And putting all that aside, but to get at the more substantive, I mean, we all know that stuff is ridiculous. We all know that stuff is ridiculous. But to get this stuff that people take more seriously about women and about what it means to be a woman. And like we talked about earlier before we turned on the camera, right, about the idea of having it all, right? And that's in the Jewish world and outside the Jewish world. That having it all, to be, to whether having it all, whether that means having an incredible career and being an engineer and patents and a CEO or whatever that means to you, and having a family and that sort of sense of having it all, or whether in the Jewish sense it means, whether you want to be this, Ashes Chayil with the seven children who are, all perfect Torah scholars and also, the head of Hadassah and the women's club and, whatever that means to you, that all of these can veer off into the negative. Mm. All of these can veer off. I would say that all of these are gray areas. That the idea of having it all, no matter how you define it, or any of the individual aspects of the having it all, I would say are gray zones. That all of these things are basically positive. We can see the positivity in all of these things. And I think we can also see where they can all veer off and become unhealthy. And I think that what the Torah is modeling for us is that, and this is something that, I'll be honest, as men, it's not the challenge that we have in the same way. There are other challenges that men have, but I think still in the world today, women have this challenge of there's so much that is held up as positive and yet can be pushed over the edge, and all of a sudden it's positive, it's positive, it's positive, and then it's just too much. It's just not. And so these women are taking, again, to go back to the idea of chesed. Chesed, right, is love. It's breaking down boundaries. And when it becomes too much, it's sexual perversion. So it's the idea of taking this sexuality, which I would say is a type of chesed. It's, right, sexuality is this sort of thing where it's a beautiful thing, it's a wonderful thing. It's good both emotionally, physically, and yet you blow it up too much and it becomes a sickness. And I think we have here women who are taking charge of that, who are taking charge of what in their time was seen as what it is to be woman. In their context, what it was to be woman was to be procreative, at least within these stories. And they're taking this act of being procreative and really taking charge of it, and where it maybe seem like it's about to go overboard, it's having the power to bring that into control. So I think there's a certain amount of sort of a modeling of control.